Hello, I'm Max DuBoff, and I'm the Director of Education at Bruchim, and I want to talk a bit about circumcision and egalitarianism. One big question which I want to ask is, do the values of egalitarianism, which are so important to so many Jewish communities today, conflict in any sorts of ways with the practice of circumcision? And ultimately, what I'll say is it depends. It depends on what you think about circumcision, and it depends on what you think about egalitarianism. But I think that this question is really worth asking, and I hope that you'll agree. I want to talk a bit about circumcision and some ways that folks are opting out of traditional practices around it. And then I want to talk about traditional sources related to circumcision, rabbinic sources in particular, and then to ask this big question, is circumcision consistent with egalitarianism? And if it is, how so? And then I want to talk a little bit about what Bruchim does. So, one reason to talk a little bit about halakha, Jewish law, is that Jewish ethics draws on halakha, Jewish law, in a lot of different ways. No matter what your relationship is to Jewish law and Jewish practice, there's so much in our tradition, and engaging with traditional Jewish perspectives is part of what it means to live a Jewish life and to be a Jew today. And I'm so happy that we have the opportunity to engage with a lot of our traditional sources. And it's really hard to do any kind of Jewish ethics and provide Jewish perspectives unless one is engaging with halakha. So, one thing to note about circumcision and halakha is that circumcision is not the same as brit milah, as ritual circumcision. This is important because a lot of folks, even who observe circumcision in some sense, are already opting out of brit milah, that is ritual circumcision. So if you do want to have ritual circumcision, it has to be on the 8th day, if possible, of the baby's life. And so hospital circumcision usually doesn't count. And a lot of halachic sources encourage hatavat dam brit, removing a single drop of blood from the penis, if there is a hospital circumcision or other kind of circumcision that's not on the 8th day. So, yeah, this important point is that the practice of circumcision is somewhat different from brit milah, from ritual circumcision. Other interesting aspects of circumcision and halakha today are that any baby born to a Jewish mother, including a surrogate, is Jewish, regardless of circumcision. And this is important because it is really something that impacts things like ritual participation, things like folks having b'nai mitzvah and taking an aliyah to the Torah. So if someone is born Jewish, it simply doesn't matter if they're circumcised. And so circumcision status really doesn't affect these aspects of ritual participation. But in many communities, circumcision is required for conversion for anyone who can be circumcised. And so that does create extra wrinkles. So why do some people opt out of brit milah? And again, this is folks who might be observing circumcision outside of ritual circumcision, as well as folks who are not observing circumcision at all. Some people are more comfortable with a hospital circumcision, or maybe want to separate naming and celebration, a ceremony for the baby, from the circumcision. Some people are concerned about risk of complications or respecting a child's autonomy, maybe uncomfortable with the process or symbolism of circumcision. That's something I'll talk about a lot more here. And then a lot of folks are concerned about other possible effects of circumcision as well. So, I want to talk about some traditional sources related to circumcision that help give us an idea of the symbolism of circumcision. And these aren't going to be conclusive for any particular point, but I think they'll really provide a lot of background for us to think about these questions of circumcision and egalitarianism by considering just a small sampling of aspects of circumcision in our tradition and ways that Jewish sources relate to circumcision. So one thing I do want to note is that there are some really excellent scholarly responses to circumcision. I draw a lot in this presentation on Shia Cohen's book, Why Aren't Jewish Women Circumcised? But a lot of the books here provide so much of the history of circumcision, as well as a lot of analysis of how circumcision is practiced today. Super valuable for anyone who is considering circumcision. So one aspect of circumcision in Tanakh, in the Bible, is that circumcision is a marker of tribal identity. So peoples other than the Israelites in Tanakh are frequently called uncircumcised, right? And so this is a sort of a way of referring to whole groups, right? The Israelites are referred to as circumcised. Other nations, especially the Philistines, are referred to as uncircumcised. And so tribal identity is something that is sort of different in some ways from how we see ourselves today, but some people do find some similarities. And this is something I'll return to later. So getting into rabbinic sources. So the Mishnah was composed about 2000 to 1800 years ago. And so starting from the Mishnah and continuing into the Talmud after it, there's really an emphasis on the importance of circumcision. And so the Mishnah says that one should perform circumcision even on Shabbat, even though it's an activity that would otherwise seem to be prohibited on Shabbat. But one interesting thing is that when there's doubt about whether to perform circumcision, for example, because of a baby with both male and female genitalia, according to the Talmud, there's some debate about whether to perform the circumcision on Shabbat. So moving into an example from the Talmud, so this is about 1500 years ago, give or take, although the source specifically quoted here is a bit older, we see a real emphasis on circumcision, and in particular on Avraham, the first Jew who circumcised himself, and really on something special that Avraham has access to because of his circumcision. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, one of the great rabbis of our tradition about 1800 years ago, is saying that Avraham was only truly called wholehearted after his circumcision. And there's some detailed textual analysis here, which I won't get into, but there's this idea that there's something special that someone can have access to because of circumcision. And this will be important later. There's also this question about what sort of covenant circumcision is. So there's the covenant of circumcision that God has with Abraham in Genesis 17. And then there's the covenant with God and the Israelites at Mount Sinai with the revelation and the giving of the Torah. And one tendency in rabbinic sources is to conflate these two covenants, to see them as part of one covenant. But another approach is to see them as two different covenants. And so some of what we might think about egalitarianism and circumcision might relate to this question of how many covenants are there and how do people enter these covenants? Is circumcision a way to enter a covenant? And what does that mean? Another aspect of circumcision in the Jewish tradition and traditional sources is this idea that circumcision helps to complete creation. And we see this in a debate between Rabbi Akiva, one of our most important rabbis about 1900 years ago, and Turnus Rufus, a Roman. And so Turnus Rufus asked Rabbi Akiva, if God wants circumcision, why doesn't the baby come out circumcised? And Rabbi Akiva brings some bread and some grain and says, oh, isn't the bread so much better than the grain? Humans can improve on creation. Then Rabbi Akiva also says that circumcision is because God gives the Israelites, the Jews, the commandments to refine the Jews through the commandments. And so a lot of what this raises for me is this question of how do we relate to the commandments and how can we become better people and become closer to Judaism and to God through Jewish practices. So one other thing which I want to mention in rabbinic sources is that some of the justifications for circumcision are pretty far from a lot of values today. So for example, Maimonides' Rambam about 1,000 years ago thinks that one of the main reasons for circumcision is to limit sexual desire. And so he's working with a very different paradigm here. And there's something uncomfortable about that I think we really need to take seriously, a sort of demonization of sexuality that is related to circumcision. Another aspect that gets into sort of gendered relations and sex as well related to circumcision, I'm bringing from Bechor Shor about 900 years ago. And this is reflected in some other sources as well, and something that Shia Cohen discusses a bunch in his book on circumcision. And what Bechor Shor says is that as the blood of circumcision brings males into a covenant with God. Blood of menstruation brings women into a covenant with God. And so this relates to this idea that there's maybe one covenant that people are entering in different ways, but this is sort of reflecting something, that might be uncomfortable, or for some people that might be empowering, but ways of viewing circumcision in our tradition often fall along lines of sex and gender, which are deeply uncomfortable for many folks who are thinking about these sorts of issues today. All right, so let's get to this big question. Is circumcision consistent with egalitarianism? And I'll just mentioned, a lot of these sources are very good. The two on the right here, there's a great article by the sociologist Michael Kimmel about his own son's circumcision and thinking about issues of feminism. There's also been some great work on circumcision in response to masculinity studies by Howard Eilbart Schwartz and by Harry Broad. Definitely recommend checking those out. So when we're thinking about egalitarianism, one of the big questions is, what does egalitarianism mean, right? And so there are all sorts of different ways that we can understand egalitarianism, and how we understand egalitarianism will very much impact whether it conflicts with circumcision in some way. So one way of understanding egalitarianism is that if a practice isn't discriminatory now, then it doesn't need to be changed. And folks who think this are generally going to think that it's totally cool that mitzvot are based on anatomy. So here an example is Brit Milah, right, which requires a penis, or Kedushat Mishpacha or Nida, things related to menstruation. So that's one way of viewing egalitarianism. Another way maybe of viewing egalitarianism is that anatomically based mitzvot are okay, but public practices related to them maybe aren't, right? So I mentioned before that some folks now, and this is becoming more common, are having a very small circumcision, maybe circumcision ceremony, and then some kind of larger public ceremony to welcome and name a baby, right? And so this sort of vision of egalitarianism is something that those sorts of folks are likely to be sympathetic to. And then another view of egalitarianism is that traditional practices, which are themselves opposed to some of the values that we have today, should be modified. And so when we're thinking about egalitarianism, a lot of what we want to be thinking about is, how can we create inclusive, just, equitable communities? What sorts of practices can we have that will allow us to really actualize those sorts of lofty values in our communities? One thing, though, which I think is not negotiable, is that traditional halakha is sexist, right? We really have to engage with these sorts of historical problems with halakha if we're going to build better communities today. Even folks who are not living halachic lives as they see it, or as halakha would see it, are still engaging with halachic practices if they're engaging with circumcision. So Shia Cohen, in his book, Why Aren't Jewish Women Circumcised?, addresses why there's not some kind of initiation ritual for female babies. And what he says is that classical rabbinic Judaism has always been, and many circles still is, a male-dominated culture. These cultural norms explain why the absence of circumcision from women was not problematic for rabbinic Judaism. On the contrary, it would have confirmed for the rabbis their deeply held conviction that only men were the real Jews, and that while women certainly were part of the Jewish people, their Jewishness was inferior to that of males, the real Jews, right? And so if we're trying to build these more inclusive, equitable, just communities, we have to understand that circumcision in the past, at least, embodied some of these patriarchal values, some of these values that we now abandon. And we're doing better now. But then the question is, does circumcision still embody these? And that's a really difficult question, and that's an open question. And it's something I encourage all of us to think about. So there are many Jewish feminists who have maintained that mitzvot, practices that are based on anatomy, should continue to be practiced and maybe even have liberatory potential. So I really like this quote by Rabbi Miriam Berkowitz, who has some great writing on Nida, on Kedushat Mishpacha, on practices related to menstruation. And what she says is one of the reasons that women in America ceased to observe family purity was their belief that these laws at their core represent a negative view of women and female biology, that essentially these laws are about women's impurity and that being ritually impure was personally degrading and insulting. But Rabbi Berkowitz maintains that Torah laws, properly understood, aim at the very opposite goal, namely that of maintaining the dignity and privacy of women. Right? So Rabbi Berkowitz thinks that even if these sorts of practices were sexist in the past, she doesn't explicitly say that, but even if that's the case, then today she thinks if we understand them in the right sort of way, then they can really be about respecting humans, respecting women, about creating these sorts of communities that we think embody our Jewish values and egalitarianism in particular. And so, there's less discussion on this sort of topic with regard to circumcision specifically, but it's a really open question. Should we defend circumcision on these sorts of lines? So the question becomes, what does circumcision show today? And I'm somewhat skeptical that we're going to be able to find ways that circumcision can represent liberatory potential and really help us embody our egalitarian values. But it's a really difficult question that I don't have fully settled views on. But here are some things that I think circumcision does show today. One thing that it shows is that male genitalia are suitable to be handled in public, right? In so many aspects of our lives, we tend to think that people should have some kind of agency, some kind of control over their own genitalia, that genitalia are not just the sort of thing that other people can use as they like. But circumcision is doing exactly that. It's using for ritual purposes the genitalia of a baby that doesn't yet have this sort of agency. And of course, there are all kinds of ways that we use the genitalia of children, to help preserve their health or things like that when we change their diapers. But that is, I think, quite different from something like a ritual purpose when it's not for preserving something like health. Circumcision also can show that the penis has a sort of special meaning, and maybe that sexual anatomy determines one's relationship with Jewish practice. This gets back to that question earlier about whether circumcision gives something special for someone's relationship with Judaism, for someone's covenant with God, for what it means to be Jewish for someone. So one way of thinking about circumcision related to what I was saying before about covenants is that there's a covenant which only those who are circumcised can access. There's lots of interesting questions here about covenant, which I won't fully get into. And then there's questions about to what extent circumcision is a reminder of these sorts of patriarchal power dynamics, some of what I was talking about earlier with ways that halakha is sexist. There are, of course, lots of other meanings of circumcision today that folks impute to the practice. Things like wanting to have a lineage with their ancestors, membership and commitment with the Jewish people. There's meanings of circumcision related to what parents think about the genitals of their children. And there's questions to be asked about how much risk parents should take on behalf of their children. And there's also concerns that at least some folks have about children being othered by their peers if they're not uncircumcised. And for a lot of people, discussion about medical benefits and risks is important. I don't want to get into any of these, and I'm not saying any of these are valid, but I think it's really important to ask about the sorts of meanings that we give to circumcision and how some of those are Jewish, how some of those are not particularly Jewish, and how we can then think about what it means to create and to help others create Jewish identities that are as robust as possible. So the big question I want to leave us with is, how should we form Jewish identity today? Circumcision alone, I think, shouldn't be enough for Jewish identity, right? There are all kinds of robust ways that we can help build Jewish identity. And there are lots of folks who are circumcised and don't have much sense of Jewish identity at all. So we have the power to help ourselves form and to help others form connections with Judaism. And I don't think we should be limited by circumcision. But the question is, if circumcision is not a primary driver of Jewish identity, why are we preserving circumcision? And then we need to ask ourselves, what can and should it represent for us? And then Can circumcision really help us work towards these values of justice and equity for all? Can circumcision help us work towards more inclusive and caring communities? If we acknowledge the ways that circumcision has been related to sexist power structures, then we can begin to think about these questions for ourselves today. And the answer is not simply that it was linked to bad power structures in the past, so it is today, but there's real questions to be asked here. And so I hope I've convinced you that we should take seriously this question of whether circumcision and egalitarianism are consistent, and if so, how. So what I've talked about today is that many people are opting out of Brit Milah already, whether they're continuing to circumcise or not. And traditional sources in Judaism view circumcision as very important, but often for reasons that we wouldn't necessarily accept today, which means that we really do need to renegotiate our relationship with circumcision. And so if egalitarianism means trying to create equitable communities and we take tradition seriously, then we do need to grapple with circumcision's inequitable history. And we have the need, but also the opportunity to determine what circumcision means to us today. I'll also just say briefly that Bruchim is an excellent organization that really does try to help create a Jewish world where everyone, regardless of circumcision status, is welcome in Jewish communities. A lot of what Bruchim does is connecting non-circumcising Jews with welcoming communities and clergy and resources. And Bruchim also promotes conversation and learning about circumcision like this right here. Thank you so much.